Okay, greetings, students. I'm here today with Julie Coiro, who is a professor at the University of Rhode Island. And I'm going to have her introduce herself and then ask her the big question for today. Julie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So hello. As Joyce said, my name is Julie Coiro, and I teach mostly the undergraduate and graduate reading courses. And so I spend a lot of time. My background is as a special education teacher first, and then I have a master's as a reading specialist and curriculum development. And then I have a PhD in educational psychology. And so a lot of those things combine in terms of how I pretty much see everything from the perspective of reading, especially reading to learn. Most of my focus has been on reading informational texts, and that's kind of what brought me to think of the internet as an exciting place to access more information, to meet new people and have conversations about new ideas, and then try to make sense of information as it's presented to from a lot of different perspectives and formats and mediums. So.
Julie, when you say reading to learn, do you mean that distinction between that age where we grow beyond learning to read and then we start reading to learn? Is that a distinction you're making?
So in a sense, that's traditionally what it means is, kindergarten or preschool or from birth to age grade 3, we kind of focus on teaching kids how to read. But that seems to be mostly about reading as decoding. And so I really think about reading to learn from birth to grade 3 as well, and talking to learn and listening to learn, and reading comprehension as meaning making, whether you're reading or listening or talking. So obviously I'm very interested and focused on teaching kids how to read, how to decode information and text. But I'm much more interested in this context in getting kids excited about asking questions, giving them pictures and videos to kind of spark some curiosity, and then helping them, no matter if they can decode or not, actually find things that address their curiosity and honestly make them more curious.
Okay, so you've already mentioned a number of media formats and a number of approaches. And so I'm just going to ask you to step back for a second and tell me, this is a course called Emerging Literacies. And I know you've written a book on research relating to new literacies. What is literacy? Has it changed?
That's a really big question. So I think part of the tricky part about answering what is literacy is there's so many different people and theories about what literacy is. And so one of the purposes of the Handbook of Research in New Literacies was to not really say that this is the one way to think about new literacies, as much as recognize literally the world of definitions. And so we had 65 different chapters from people around the world who thought about new literacies in lots of different ways. And so I want to back up just for a second to think about even traditional literacy. I think at the heart of it is it's a little bit different than just reading. Literacy, it very traditionally is a combination of reading and writing. And then it kind of evokes, well, what does it mean to be a literate person? Well, what does it mean to be able to read and write? And so as texts become more complex, as they become more digital, as they're shared more widely, I think the definition of literacy broadens, and if in nothing else, in terms of, well, what are the different ways that we need to learn how to read and write? And so that's where kind of the multimedia part of things comes into play. For me personally, and so I co-edited the handbook with 3 other authors, and myself and Don Liu kind of came from one world of new literacies, which took a very cognitive approach to thinking about a broader definition of what it means to read, write, and communicate on the internet. And so we really took a an approach to the new literacies as the new reading, writing, and communication strategies and mindsets needed to be able to use the internet to ask questions, locate information, critically evaluate the information, synthesize across multiple mediums, and then figure out which medium or combination of mediums best is able to communicate what you learned. So those were, Don Liu and I had kind of that cognitive in the beginning perspective, new literacies. The other two authors, Colin Lancashire and Michelle Noble, kind of came from a different world of new literacies as a social practice. And that kind of involves the whole way of thinking and doing literacy. And for them, it was much more of a social kind of act, which didn't really focus on particular reading and writing skills as much as bigger new literacy practices. So that gets a little vague, but one of the reasons we put the handbook together was to see if we could bridge the gap between those two ways of thinking. And lo and behold, I'm sure I'm not the only one, but as a result of that handbook and other things, I really now take a very combined approach to thinking about literacy, new literacies from both a cognitive and a social kind of way.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're going to be talking about different ways we make meaning these days, and how learning has become social and connected, and so that's part of it. But I'm also very curious about how new forms of text affect students' ability to make sense. So we talked before we even put the broadcast on about Nicholas Carr and his dismay over hypertext and the fact that it interrupts the flow of a book and the distractions that it creates. But are there new skills as students read in a hyperlinked environment or in an environment that is media rich and broken by all sorts of different media items? I don't know.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed again and again and again, which got me thinking about the difference in reading on the internet, and here I mean, hyperlinked text. And so in a typical book, even if you're not quite understanding what you're reading, you have a book that's maybe 20 pages. The sequence never changes. You could flip back and forth, but the sequence of the ideas is pretty static and standard. There may be some pictures and maybe even some other different kinds of multiple media, but the book that you're handed is never going to look any different, even if you work through the book in a variety of ways. When you go on the internet, if you started a website with even a paragraph that has 10 different hyperlinks, as soon as the reader clicks on a particular link, if you can imagine a book being constructed in the sequence that somebody clicks on the links, every single person has the opportunity to build and construct an entirely different book. And the reason that matters is, in a print form, it is very important for readers to monitor what they're thinking and if they're understanding. It's less important to monitor where they're going, because they either could go back or forward. On the internet, every time you click a link, if you are not actively monitoring, is this where I want to be? Should I keep clicking? Should I back up and go somewhere else? If you're not actively monitoring that every single click, and I've watched kids and adults, in about 4 or 5 minutes, you construct a completely irrelevant text. And for the librarians in the group here, you've probably come across people who, you send them on a search and you leave them alone for 5 minutes and you come back and you're thinking, how the heck did you ever get there? And I think what happens is we don't know how to monitor. We don't know if and when we need to monitor. Well, this flashing something was really interesting. And sometimes it could be distracting in a good way that we can follow our interests. But often we end up kind of literally just jumping from one place to the other without any recognition of how those texts are connected. And that then impacts our ability to make sense of the information, remember the information or not, and actually be able to use it.
So is this connected to Howard Rangel's kind of notion of infotension and self-regulation?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, in the reading comprehension world, self-regulation and monitoring, as well as fix-up strategies, is pretty much the end-all, be-all for what high ability readers do. It's not that effective comprehenders always understand what they're reading. It's that they recognize when they don't understand it and they stop and they apply some kind of fix-up strategy. So in the same way, if you're reading on the internet and you're not paying attention to not only what you're understanding, but where you are in that space, you've lost the ability to apply any fix-up strategies. And then all of a sudden you're somewhere and you don't know where you are, how you got there, how to get back, or what sense you're making.
And you also have a whole bunch of choices too, right? So you're in a database, for instance, you can email that document back to yourself and then it doesn't become a hyperlink document to the same extent. So, I mean, for me, I know that one of my things to do is to get offline and read sometimes because I know that works for me. What are, and that may not be the way it works for everybody, but what are the new skills and how can we help learners be literate with the traditional texts that we find on the internet and also other types of text, which, I mean, I see, of course, I see all media as text. And we're reading in different ways, but I know you could talk a book on this, but I'm just wondering if there are like a top 5 list of things that maybe we could talk about that would increase help us build more literate students.
Yeah, so I think probably the easiest and easy and concrete way to start is to think about reading search engine results. And for some people, you might think, well, what are you reading? That's just searching, and the computer helps you find things. But that's in and of itself one of those regulatory kinds of things. If you realize that you are actually in control of the search engine and what you type in actually gives you a certain set of search engine results. So from those search engine results, for example, you need to make choices about which link to click on. And so one of the new literacy strategies, if you will, is to not always just start with what appears at the top. And so skimming and scanning takes on a more important role because you have much different the ability is it echoing for you?
It's okay.
So the ability to, I don't know if I can talk, but think about fluency. So even as you're reading through the search engine results, there's a difference between reading every single word, as we typically do in print, and kind of skimming and scanning. And I have this kind of saying that I have, especially for young children. So when we talk about fluency offline, we think about how many words you can read a minute. And we look online, it's actually more accurately how many words you can skip a minute to actually find the things that are useful to you. So skimming and scanning takes on new importance. Skimming and scanning for the difference between a bold word that might show up in the search result because you actually searched for that. So it's not necessarily that it's an important vocabulary word. There's a reason that it's bolded. So you've skimmed and you've scammed, and now you have to actually make some inferences about which link is going to bring me where I want to go. And so that then, even before you've clicked, moves us from just locating to thinking about critically evaluating. So it might be evaluating for relevance. is this a topic or is this a link that is going to be closely related to my topic of interest? More than just relevance, though, it might be, well, what kind of author wrote this? And what kind of organization is sponsoring this? And even from the search engine results, you can make some predictions based on part of the URL or part of the description. And so just from the search engine results, we're looking at the ability to monitor, make predictions, make inferences, evaluate relevance and reliability. And also, you mentioned thinking about preferences and what works for you. You might actually know, well, I like pictures better, or I like videos better. And so you can shape the kinds of texts that appear for you, obviously by specifying that in your search result. And so you have a lot more control than a lot of people think if you're able to monitor, what do I need? What do I prefer in terms of the information? And how relevant and reliable is it for me? So all those things, I think, take on new meaning, even from a set of search results, which is very different than, let's say, given a table of contents in a traditional book.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure, while we spend a lot of time looking at credibility, I'm not certain we spend a lot of time just explicitly saying, how are you reading this? And how are you you're sorting things too. You're reading the language, even through a Google snippet. You're saying, this seems like editorial, or this seems like scholarly, or this seems like gossip, or this, so you can put on a sorting hat for that stuff and begin to kind of build schema for what it is that you're seeing on a result list. And that's something we can actually teach. So that's maybe thing number one. What else is different, and what else can we do to encourage more literacy?
So I think something you just said, think about something when I work with librarians in particular is when we think about reliability, we often think about the source. And so what I've seen happen as a result of kids being taught to immediately think about, well, who wrote this, is they get to a website and honestly, they don't even look at the words that are written there. They immediately jump to the About Us page. They find out, okay, this person's a doctor or a lawyer or not. And they say, oh, well, of course it must be reliable. And so my question then is, well, what must be reliable? So I think one thing that I've been kind of working with library media specialists around is yes, talking about the source, but actually moving back into the text and thinking about a lot of what's happening in schools now is focusing on argumentation. And it isn't just to think about argumentation because that's the big keyword, but it really means looking at, well, what is this author actually claiming? And from what kinds of perspectives or lenses is this author seeing things or not seeing things? Does this information represent one side, the other side, multiple sides? And so I think a second important idea is to acknowledge the source, but then quickly move students back to figure out, well, what is the author even claiming? And how do those claims and the supportive arguments and evidence compare to the claims on another website from a different kind of an author? And so the complexity of moving beyond just single text written by a single author to comparing and contrasting across multiple authors on the same topic, but from multiple lenses, I think is a whole new way of thinking that's really hard for both reading teachers and library media specialists to think about.
Right, I so agree with you. It is not just, is this article good? Is this article bad? It really is a kind of great conversation, and where do these pieces fit together so that I can see a larger picture, and I can see that there's nuance in this, and there isn't there is no checklist that actually makes these decisions for you, and that's the fun of it in my mind. But it is complex.
And that's the tricky part. And there's a really nice article written. It's it's a little bit older, by Chuck Miola, called Chuck the Checklist. And it really argues that that's a useful first step, but it's very surface level. And a lot of the research that we've been doing lately suggests that students are not able to move beyond those surface level kinds of characteristics to think about how multiple characteristics fit together in a way, and then beyond just the single page.
Right, and I think, that really comes to mind a lot when I think about what a primary source looks like today. So we think that the documents may be written by Benjamin Franklin, who wrote a letter casually to someone, is this kind of grand notion of a primary source. Well, the equivalent of that today might well be somebody who's on the ground as a first responder writing a blog post. And, maybe somebody would have dismissed Franklin's letters as a boy. And as we dismiss some blog posts because some teachers don't understand the value that social media can play in putting these pieces together and understanding what the story is. Because the story is not just from one lens.
I think you bring up a really good point, and then we talk about the value of primary sources, but I think we often define that to be, those things from a long time ago. And there's incredible value and merit in those things. But when we think about primary sources now, for some reason, rightly so, there's all kinds of questions. It's like, we can't trust anything that's a primary source right now because there's this digital stuff mixed up. And we have more access to people who sometimes lie or persuade us, but there are so many primary sources in the past that did that as well. And so I think teaching kids, I think we have to be careful to not teach kids that everything in print and in the past and was okay, and everything in digital and in the future is not, because it's so much messier than that.
Okay, we're on the same page. So, speaking about paging or pages, what about writing? Is digital writing something that has, digital writing has changed. It's not the same as writing for teachers' eyes only, perhaps, and also in a static form. What do we need to think about in terms of student writing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think a lot of the work that I do with teachers and librarians now similarly call into question new ways of, quote, writing. Things like creating or composing or remixing. And so I think, again, we have to be careful to not place value judgments about what we know writing to be, putting letters on a page and making a nice essay, and possibly valuing some of the other ways of composing in extremely creative ways. And this has been hard for me, even as a traditional reading and writing person, to make the leap, to see the value of a group of students making a 30-second public service announcement, and the enormous amount of reading and writing and thinking skills that went into summarizing and synthesizing and figuring out how best to compose something for a particular argument. And so I think the struggle has been for teachers in particular they see the value of those things, but it's not always valued from the administrative or the parent or the putting a grade on a piece of paper kind of perspective. Well, we don't know how to grade a public service announcement, and thus it must not be good writing. So I think that leap between understanding and valuing traditional reading and writing, as much as a traditional person as I am, there's equal amounts of value in a lot of the new things that I don't think maybe we've gotten quite a handle on because they're also new and rapidly changing. But somehow as librarians, as public school teachers, as parents, as we start to see kids using these things and excited by creating them, we have to figure out a way to accept that and not forget everything that we've learned to help them appreciate and grow in those new worlds, even if we don't know exactly how to create in those ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that I don't think it's a huge jump to create rubrics and assessment tools that value very much the same types of skills that would be present in an essay. You know, structure, a precision of language, solid argument based on evidence, a powerful hook and clincher. All of these things are the way we use transition sentences. All of these things are present in that PSA you described. And it may have a greater audience and longer legs, and may even give the students a greater sense of pride in their work. So,
and that I think is, if what I think is missing though is the instruction in how to use these digital texts and tools to make a solid argument and to integrate information. And I think sometimes we forget, well, it's so exciting. Of course, they're just going to be good at this. And then when, they spend a long time and they get really excited and it's not really the quality that we wanted, I think we have to jump back and think about, so how do we support writers, composers, digital producers in a way that's different than just writing grammatically correct and interesting sentences?
So scaffolding can help, right? So you don't, the ticket to production is an outline or a storyboard, right? So it doesn't, again, it's not that much of a difference. It's not a great translation. It seems to me not. And I think that's what we're looking at here, as you and I are both working with pre-surface educators. What is it that we need to think about to make this not just a sexy experience, but to make it a deep learning experience and to make the products successful as creative writing activities, as meaningful contributions.
And that I think is the crux of it, in a lot of the writing that I'm working on now, a lot of the professional development that I work on with teachers, it's really about making intentional, purposeful choices about the kinds of technology we're asking students to use, how it addresses higher levels of thinking, while also giving more space for students to be creative. And so I think that's the tricky part of is how do we still stay focused on the things we know that are important, if they're higher level thinking or information literacy skills or whatever that content is, but still take advantage of the opportunities of digital texts and tools to kind of open up the ways that kids can express their understanding of that content.
So I don't want to keep you too long. I want to ask you one more question, and I'm going to give you a choice.
Okay.
All right. So choice number one would be, can you give me an example of effective practice in literacy instruction or creativity? Or are there categories, and I don't want you to name individual tools, but are there buckets into which really powerful tools fit that our students need to be able to know about so they become like the pen, the paper? What would you say a new teacher should start with in a technology literacy toolkit?
So I'm gonna talk real briefly about these 4 categories that I've been playing around with in terms of ways that teachers or librarians can use technology with learners. And the first one is this category of what we often do. It's not a bad thing, it's just we need to move beyond, but giving information to students, providing access to information by, honestly, teachers and librarians doing most of the work themselves. They're curating, they're finding, they're sorting, they're categorizing, and they're saying, here's a wonderful set of resources to further your learning. And that's what librarians used to do when they made that wonderful bookcase when the 2nd grade class came in, and everything is there for you. So I think technology has a very important use there the thing to remember is we're doing most of the work, and how do we start to relinquish some of that work in ways that get kids more involved? So the next kind of level is what I call prompting supports, prompting thinking, where, okay, well, here's a range of resources, or you can find your own resources, but once you get there, here's 3 things I'd like you to think about. So there's a little more structure, a little more freedom. And if you're asking them to think about open-ended kinds of things, it kind of leads to some voice and choice in how you learn, how you select, and how you represent what you read about. So the other 2 are much more focused on, okay, well, what if I really want to allow students to take more control? And so that whole concept of making and creating. How do we as adults take our hands off of the computer and hand over the responsibility to the students to allow them to make and create and compose? And then finally, this category of reflection. I don't think that's used as much as it could be. Again, from a traditional reading comprehension perspective, the ability to finish reading and reflect on, what did I learn? What steps did I take? Where did I get stuck? And what might I want to do now? I think we can use technology, for example, screencasting at the very least, to capture students' reflections in the moment, after in the moment, and pull that together in a portfolio that they can almost reflect on their reflections over time. And so to me, those categories of using technology to give information, prompt higher level thinking, and then moving control over to students for making and reflecting is for me at least 4 camps of ways that we might use technology.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Julie. I think those are wonderful things to think about, and I'm hoping we're going to be walking the walk this semester as you guys work on your projects, both writing and sharing with the world. So, any last thoughts from my students before we say thank you and goodbye?
No, I would just say remember all those good teaching and learning strategies that you know, because they don't all disappear. There's just a bigger range of them now that the internet and technology is around.
Thank you, Julie. And if my students wanted to contact you, what would be the best way?
The best way would probably be to email me at jcoiro@uri.edu.
Wonderful. And I'll put that on our notes for this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.